Last week, we uploaded an episode featuring Patrick Greenfield, a biodiversity reporter for The Guardian. In this latest episode, Rene and Patrick discussed the effectiveness of the VCM and the media's role in creating fear for potential participants entering the market. Given the importance of this discussion, we created a summary video highlighting the key points from our conversation with Patrick Greenfield. We hope you like it. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
Patrick, welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. It's lovely to see you.
Great to be here.
Thank you for joining me. I think I'm really excited for our conversation today. For context for the audience, you're an environment reporter at The Guardian.
Yes.
And your focus over the last, 18 months or so, you've been covering a lot of stories around carbon markets. And I think, many of the, let's say, practitioners in carbon markets have this adversarial relationship with you. Do you think that's fair in terms of statement at the moment, in terms of just the criticisms and sort of the reporting that you've done has maybe yielded adversarial kind of responses from folks in my side of the camp?
I think so I don't see it as two sides. I don't see myself.
Neither do I. I think we should look for middle ground. But I think many people that I spoke with prior to this conversation were kind of, I don't know, they were just, there was a bit of hesitancy from their perspective around engaging with the media, which I think makes no sense to me.
Of course, look, I see the comments, I get the emails, I get the DMs and that kind of thing, of course. And I have phone, but at the same time, you'd be surprised with who I speak with, right? I have lots of conversations on and off the record with project developers, people at carbon standards, people who are massively pro carbon markets, people who think they're a terrible idea. Mm-hmm. That's the job of a reporter. We speak with everybody.
Good.
Then that informs our coverage.
And so I think going to that point, please elaborate for me the job of the reporter.
I think when it comes to the carbon market, our job is to look at it from the point of view of a reader. We're not here to be fans of anything. That's not what news reporters should ever do. And I think importantly, we need to take a critical look, right? So from the point of view of a reader, their main exposure to the carbon market has been carbon neutral adverts. I think it's fair to say. I think it was the kind of Greta Thunberg effect in 2019, right? It was the kind of latest explosion of the voluntary carbon market. And the way we as a newspaper and others have too, have approached this subject is to go, right, well, does that claim stand up? What is a carbon neutral flight? Looking at the Red Plus credit, for example, or the cook stove credit or the renewable energy credit and saying, well, does that stack up? Is that something that has actually cancelled out those emissions that are definitely going into the atmosphere, that are definitely heating the planet? Can we rely on this unregulated system for the basis of massive claims from multi-billion-dollar companies, right? Because that's ultimately what it comes down to. But from us, we just want to explain to our readers what they should know, whether this is something that really has substance and, crucially, is something that could be scaled up as a solution to the climate crisis, right? I think that's kind of another criticism that comes up a lot. Why aren't you writing about the good this could do? That, I think, maybe...
That was going to be one of my questions.
Right. Our editors are desperate for good news stories, right? We don't want to be writing about the end of the world in a slow way in lots of different kind of formats all the time.
But there's all the adage, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Oftentimes there is a bias, I feel, across the types of stories, and certainly the headlines that grab attention tends to be more on the negative side. There's effectively conflation, I think, sometimes that occurs, certainly with just certain words that are being utilized, like worthless. As a proponent of this in this space, I feel that that's too deterministic. I think there's a risk adjustment lens that we need to look at things through. What do you think on that?
I think that from a carbon credits point of view, its primary worth, if we're going to think of it as a commodity, is that it avoids or removes carbon from the atmosphere.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't do that, what if it's worth? So what is its worth, right? We don't buy bananas that don't exist that might be fair trade, right? That doesn't quite make sense.
I would challenge that notion.
Yeah.
I think that nothing in the world has 100% certainty. Look at, for example, in the medical sphere, right? We look at vaccines. The efficacy of a vaccine or a drug is never 100%. Just let's say it's a 10% discount with regards to the potential of that project. To then bring it down to worthless status, I think just doesn't achieve the purpose of the intended criticism.
The people that produced the studies that we looked at for that article that had such a big cut through, right? They were disappointed by their own findings. They are invariably researchers who have dedicated their lives as well to protecting tropical rainforests. So you can have a scheme, for example, that is stopping a modest amount of deforestation that, under the logics of carbon markets, absolutely must be rewarded for that, because it's a very hard, very difficult thing to do. And lots of big projects who are producing nonsense credits that absolutely shouldn't have existed at all, that actually is the majority of the market when it comes to RED+, according to these studies, right? It's complicated. So the worthlessness thing there, right, is absolutely key when you go back to this idea of offsetting, because it's not a donation, right? According to some aspects, it's a commodity. You're buying a thing to cancel out an emission from somewhere else.
Sure.
And so it's absolutely crucial that is real, that does represent a ton of removed or avoided emissions for it to work.
I think the market would agree to that. There's certain elements that I would agree with, but I just think, what is now the result of what's happened in terms of the critiques around the baselines and all of these criticisms around this concept of worthlessness, right? Sure. Over-crediting, ultimately what it comes down to is that the incentive to protect the rainforests has effectively now come back down to zero. So I think there's a causality, right? So yes, criticism is required to ensure the highest possible integrity. Do you feel that that's a fair statement for me to make?
Sure.
We always need to strive for higher integrity. Great. But if the value is close to zero or zero, then the opposite incentive, it's a perverse incentive, it occurs on the ground. Now the farmers, let's say in Brazil, right? Cattle farmers, well, they have no incentive to protect that land. They're going to get paid more for actually cutting it down and running cattle on those forests.
This idea that I guess the media in some way is responsible for organising the voluntary carbon market and that kind of thing. We're not.
No, I
that's something the VCM organises, right? Yep. It's our job to report about it.
Sure.
And to be frank, didn't do a great job of it, right? And that's why it's all fallen apart and collapsed. The great thing about markets, when they function, is that they reward winners and they punish losers, right? To be totally brutal about it.
Great.
Well-regulated market. And so in a system where you avoid, with carbon markets, in a system where you effectively avoid carbon emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere, you should expect financial reward for it. But when you don't, which is what these studies have highlighted, which is you shouldn't expect a reward for that.
Why does it have to be binary? That it's either great or it's terrible, worthless.
You know, this is just a moment in time. This will pass, right? But it could happen again if the problems aren't resolved. Okay. Right? Why did it all fall apart last time? Yeah, the financial crisis was a problem, but it was also to do about integrity. There's a lot of nonsense going on, and those issues weren't sorted out, and they haven't. And that's why, in part, it's all fallen apart again, right? From outside looking in, it would seem like a good idea that actually the integrity issues are resolved this time, so it does have a chance to scale. If I'm going out to buy carbon credits, right, I want to know where that money is going. It's not an unreasonable thing to ask. It's not anti-capitalist or anti-markets to want to know, okay, I've given my money to this scheme in Kenya or Tanzania or Colombia. I want to know where that's gone, right? It's simple, and it's basic things like that the VCM can't do at the moment.
Well, I don't think any commodity can do, quite frankly. I mean, when we had a coffee this morning, the provenance of that coffee and how much revenue went to those coffee farmers is almost impossible to determine.
The VCM is meant to be about something more. It's about solving one of the biggest problems that humanity is facing.
It's about channeling finance to deliver outcomes. There are lots of projects that get really high ratings.
Yep.
Right. So I would just challenge that notion that it's not all negative news stories. To your point, I think that there's a kind of fatigue with regards to the negative stories. Let's focus on where we can be constructive.
Sure.
And look at this mechanism. This is essentially my view. Yes, it is an opinion around the carbon crediting process. If we can ensure the integrity, and I think that we all have common ground on that, can actually deliver scale and deliver that finance to where it can make impact. And there are numerous examples of that occurring. Would you agree?
But we need scale. We don't need small projects that are having kind of modest impacts. We need massive kind of multi-billion-dollar, multi-trillion-dollar schemes and the rest of it, which I'm sure will, of course, be made up of smaller schemes and the rest of it, right?
Sure.
But the VCM, as things stand, is tiny financially in terms of what we might need it to be if it's going to become a viable tool.
I would agree to that. It was scaling, and then obviously it scaled back. But I think, like you said, I've seen this picture before, and I think we are now building stronger foundations in order to enable that scale. We saw in 2020 and 21 in particular, you called it the Greta Thunberg effect. I subscribe to that notion. An influx of capital from various different financial intermediaries, and significant quotients of capital started to come in and invest into these. That was then distributed via primary and secondary markets, and the flows went into the existing projects, but most importantly to channeling to develop a next crop of projects. My fear today is that because of effectively the demand destruction that's occurred over the last 18 months or so, because of effectively this erosion of trust in the underlying, that investment is essentially retreated, and it'll take quite a long time for it to come back at scale.
There's a lot in there, right? I think to start with this kind of question of being a commodity, I was reading David Antonioli's reflections on this. I sense in his writings, at least, whether going down this commodity route is a good idea, right? For David, David seems to be thinking about carbon markets as markets with a social purpose mainly, not whether this is going to have something that makes investment banks and hedge funds excited. Some people don't want market solutions. Some people absolutely do. I think from the kind of media's perspective on this, right, or something kind of many of us are looking out for, is many of these carbon projects from generation 1.0 or whatever it needs to be framed haven't worked, unfortunately, in terms of the offsets they produce. So worthless, right? I'm happy to use that word.
I think we disagree on that, but sure. It's okay. We found some middle ground. There's a disagreement.
And they shouldn't have a role in a high quality climate claim from a major company, right, that does need to become Paris aligned.
What about on a contribution scale as well? Like there are benefits going to those communities, right? And there are co-benefits that are associated with those activities. In a vacuum, if they did not exist, those benefits would not have occurred. Because it doesn't deliver exactly 1 ton of CO2 reductions or removals, right? Because effectively the science has improved to maybe show that that's the case. To discount that to worthless status, I don't think occurs. Because I don't see any
chunk, not all. I've never said all. We've never said all.
Okay.
Never said all.
So let's reinforce that.
Yeah. Sure. But at the same time, right, so for example, let's take Kariba. Right?
Let's take Kariba.
As a follow-up to that New Yorker piece, I spent a very, very, very long time going through to see whether we could stack up where the money was going from that 100+ million euros or whatever it was that the scheme had generated. Turns out, if you're being super generous, I think it's about 14 million or so has made it to the ground. I've got my figures a bit mixed up there, right? The majority is going to the third parties and developers. And how is that different to the oil and gas industry or another extractive industry, right, in terms of its business model? It's not really.
So when we come back to Kariba, I'm not going to try to skirt this point. It's a black eye for the market. Absolutely. We acknowledge that case, and I think that's a perfect example of media scrutiny to root out bad actors. Okay? But I'm saying there are other projects that actually have intrinsic value that may be discounted from where, let's say, a benchmark would be trading at, and that's fine. But there's an opportunity to strengthen those projects over time, to not throw out the baby with the bathwater. So how about transitioning to the new methodologies, for example, and improving these projects over time?
I was shown a kind of earlier version of that by Vera before we did this work. Mm-hmm. But I know there's kind of lots of scrutiny and back and forth with project developers and the rest of it about while it's being developed. That does appear to be better. Yep. Much more sensible approach, especially with what project developers used to be able to get away with in terms of the models they were using to generate the credits, right? But again, the jury's out. I think, me personally, I will wait to see independent analysis of that before we say, yeah, great.
And if there are good stories around that, so let's say we see a transition towards that, will you champion those good stories?
Of course. Again,
so I think we
want to talk about things that work, but I think there's a kind of there's a key difference here that I think. I hope this doesn't come across as arrogant, but I think kind of even people in the VCM miss themselves. Maybe I often see it from project developers, right? The project is not the same as the offsets. Right? If we're going to treat offsets as a commodity, and it really does come down to the methodology there to quantify the impact. So you can't have kind of additional projects in the middle of the forest, say, if we're going to talk about RED+.
What about at a jurisdictional basis?
but that's taking in the whole of the forest edge. You're trying to protect the whole of the cake there, but really you'll be protecting the forest edge, right? That's the calculation, because you're protecting the bit that would have been destroyed. That's where the additionality comes from. I think what's happened is that there's been a lot of Vera projects, if you look at the data, that were in the middle of the forest and they weren't at the edge. And crucially, because at no point have we said all of the offsets are worthless. Yes, that may be true for the projects that are bang in the middle, but for the ones at the edge, especially if there are high rates of deforestation nearby, they can be really successful. The projects in Brazil that we looked at for our investigation were not having an impact because they were, it was a time nationally when deforestation was falling under governments took environmental regulation seriously. And I think the kind of study end date was pretty much bang on when Bolsonaro took power. And I'm sure if you do that study again, that it would be the opposite finding, right? But then that also is a really important question, I think, for the VCM to consider, right? If we need a Bolsonaro, say, to have integrity for REDD+ schemes, I mean, I don't know where that leads, right? In terms of the kind of morality around this, it's kind of like you shoot the puppy economics, right?
To now kind of round home base. I think we've discussed this around avoid deforestation, the successes, the lack of thereof as well, the complexities and the nuance therein. How do we create more positive news stories to demonstrate greater success, whether it's carbon markets or more broad, like you said, different types of solutions?
That doesn't come from us. That's a question for you, and I don't accept it's a two sides thing, but that's a question for the VCM, right? If you are a solution that can scale, then you'll do it. And we'll write about it when that happens.
And you'll write the stories, the good stories of the successes.
Of course.
So can we make this as a challenge to folks in the market that are effectively now quiet because of fear of retribution, effectively, they don't want to stick their necks out, to come to you to say, hey, we're doing these really great activities, we're open to scrutiny, come and have a look at what we're doing. And if you then review that, would you then sing their praises?
People who are kind of environmental leaders who make big achievements on this issue, we'll write about it. We're kind of desperate for that, but they need to be real.
We recognize that responsibility and we accept that challenge, and we're doing that. We're doing that on a day-to-day activity, right, in terms of improving this broader market. But we want to count on the media as a partner in this, right, as the fourth estate, effectively, that always we accept that it'll be critical, right, where there is activity that is not great, but count on also when there is a transition and positive outcomes occur, that then you will basically not hype, but effectively represent those positive outcomes.
Yes.
And I think that's a fair shake. That's what we're asking for, and I think that's all you're asking for. And like you said, you're not the arbiter of that truth. You're effectively putting the onus on the market to improve and self improve.
Yeah,
that's good.
Get out the echo chamber. Get out of LinkedIn.
Yep.
Speak to some of these study authors who do want to help, and that's true for cook stoves, other types of schemes, right? They're out there and they want to support. There's no ideological thing here, but I mean, we've not talked about it, but the kind of LinkedIn hype or whatever, that's from the outside looking in, that doesn't seem to be helping anything. In terms of actually this process working towards something that's going to be a tool, right? I think even from the VCM's biggest supporters, right, that they're not claiming this is going to solve climate change or anything like that.
No, but
it'd be great to have as a tool.
But what we're agreeing is that this is a valuable tool.
Could be, not right now. Could be. It's about potential. Again, we look at the White House example, right? Mm-hmm. That was
There's a positive reinforcement of the market-based approach.
I spoke with people involved in that White House announcement, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't a rubber stamp of the status quo. It was about potential.
Sure.
And in life, people don't care about potential. They care about what happens. They care about reality, right? And so that is where it's about realizing that potential, if that potential exists.
Yeah, but it's a call to action to bring in new thoughts and effectively helping the market to scale by tracking that and ultimately delivering on that finance piece. So that's fine. Potential, but there is a lot of potential is certainly my argument. And I agree that I have potentially a biased view on that, right? But we're working tirelessly to actually improve the market long term.
Great.
And I think no one's resting on their laurels, and no one's certainly saying that this is a perfect solution. It's not. But what we're saying, it is a worthwhile solution, and it's not a worthless solution. Can keep coming back to that.
Do you accept that? The worthlessness was about the credits,
okay,
the offsets, right? No one's ever said the projects themselves are worthless or trying to sort this. None of that, obviously, that's not worthless, right? We need things that work.
Good. Cool, mate. Well, appreciate the time. Thank you very much for coming in, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to obviously provide an opportunity for you to share your voice. I'd love to welcome you back again.
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Cheers.